Hey guys, and welcome back to my channel, where today we are doing a full-length, non-spoilery review of the Girl of Fire and Thorns trilogy by Rae Carson. So, the Girl of Fire and Thorns trilogy is a young adult fantasy trilogy, and in it we are following our main character of Elisa. And she is a princess, and she is uh, the bearer of the Godstone. Essentially, many years ago on her naming day, she was chosen by God, and this gemstone appeared in her navel. And it just signifies that at some point in her life, she will perform a great act of service. And this is a really big deal, also because there is only one that is chosen every 100 years. And fast forward to present day, Elisa is 16 years old, and her family is trying to prepare her for this active service, whatever it may be, as well as protecting everybody who would try to use her, because so many people around her really want to do that. Eventually, even to the point that a rebellion group ends up kidnapping Elisa, and now she just has to try to survive, try to figure out how to help her people. And the story kind of just goes from there. Um, so going into this, I will say before we jump into it, going into this series, I really wanted to just see if it holds up, because this is a reread. I read it 7 or 8 years ago, so I wanted to see if it was just as good as I remembered it. So let's start with the world building. And first, we're going to talk about the whole religion aspect of it. And it is interesting because it very much is reminiscent of Catholicism, definitely Christianity, a little bit more Catholicism with some of the things that they're doing. However, it's either so far into the future that it's definitely no longer Catholicism, or it's like literally fantasy religion, right? And so, and obviously we have this magic in it. I didn't find that the religion was overly burdensome. So like if you are not really into religion, I didn't find it offensive in any way. It was pretty banal. And I actually think it was an interesting way to kind of do the world building for this. So I liked it. Next up, let's talk about the setting. And I thought that this was beautifully done, especially in the first book, The Girl of Fire and Thorns, because honestly, that first book was really well done in general. And we are mostly focusing on the desert. And it's just really, you just get this feeling of just how imposing this desert is, how deadly, how like everything. It's the the countries that Elisa is in, both where she, like where her family rules, as well as where she ends up because she marries their king. It's all desert or like desert adjacent. And so it is this huge desert is a really big deal. And I just thought that Rae Carson just did an excellent job with really capturing the feeling. There were other settings, especially in the later two books, and they were solid. I just don't think they were quite as well done as the desert was. I didn't quite get that same sense of being there as I did with the desert, but I did think that it was still fairly solid. And then the history of this place is really interesting because this is epic fantasy. This is not the world that we are in. And so we're finding out we do find out their history a little bit over time as we continue on with the story. And I thought it was just really interesting because what Elisa is telling us is the history as we know it. And of course, like I think most of us know that what we know of as the history isn't the only thing that is the history. And so she finds out more about it as she continues along in these stories, in the books. And I thought it was just really interesting and well done. And I really like that it was added in because it did give a sense, a sense of history to this place, right? Like it felt like it had existed for a very, very long time. And it also gave the reader some understanding of the motivations of some of the groups in this book and why they're kind of acting the way that they are. And then lastly, let's talk about the magic system. There is magic in this, as previously noted, and ultimately it is somewhat squishy. There's not a whole lot of hard rules, partially because Elisa has magic, but she doesn't really learn how to utilize it from like a teacher. She just kind of figures it out on her own. So we don't really know the rules or anything. And we only ever know, as readers, only ever know as much as Elisa knows, which like grows as the story goes on. But even at the end, there are definitely still some unanswered questions. So, but overall, I thought that the world building was done really well. This is a really interesting world that I have a few more questions about, only because we clearly just didn't have enough time to get to them in the books. And I would happily read more in this series. After that, let's talk about the characters. So obviously, I've only mentioned one character really in this review so far, and that is Elisa herself. And the reason is because this trilogy is really her story. More than, there's definitely other plots, but really it's about her and her growth and becoming a better person, a better version of herself. When we first meet her, she isn't very confident. Yes, she's a princess, but she really doesn't feel like she's what a princess should be. She thinks she's ugly and she is fat and she doesn't really know how to, maneuver people socially to get what she wants, which she thinks that like she should definitely be. She very much idolizes her older sister and says this is the perfection of what a princess should be, and I am nothing like my sister. Now, that's only half true, but obviously Elisa doesn't really know that, and so she's kind of got to work her way through a lot of her feelings. To some extent, her feelings about it, but also just recognizing that she doesn't have to be just like her sister to still be a good person, be a good princess, be a good queen. And so it's really interesting to kind of watch her really start to assert herself in the beginning. Even before this kidnapping takes place, she starts trying it out, and it's not like she's perfect overnight. She still makes a lot of mistakes, but she at least starts trying, and she does start gaining her confidence, and I really do appreciate that. I just really was rooting for her, and I liked that where we ended, she definitely had grown a lot. She was very much a different person at the end of the series than she was at the beginning of the series. But I don't think that her growth is over. And I really I liked that. I found it to be much more realistic. I will also mention, because it is a thing, that Elisa, when she is kidnapped, she does end up getting forced to march through the desert with her captors to escape, and it's more physical activity than she is really used to, and very strict rations, so a lot less food than she is used to, and she does lose a lot of weight. One thing that I do appreciate is Rae Carson very much was aware that this could be problematic and took a lot of steps to try to mitigate that. So that's why we do see Elisa start to gain some of that confidence prior to her losing weight. So we know it's not tied to her body image. And even after, she never seems to really love her body. Like, she's not like, oh, I'm skinny, so I'm amazing now. She eventually gets to a point where she's like, my body is strong, and that's awesome. But we can see that a lot of her confidence and what she's doing really isn't tied to what her body looks like. And I do appreciate Rae Carson for having the foresight to see that was potentially going to be, even though it's realistic, it could potentially be problematic, and do what they could to mitigate it. So next up, let's talk about Hector. And Hector is probably the only other character that I could say is really truly a main character. And I just found him to be bland. He was just such a good character. He's a good person. We know he's a good person. He's always going to make the right choices for the most part. And when he doesn't make the right choice, it's always for the right reasons. You know what I mean? Like, there was nothing about him that really jumped out at me as super interesting. It was fine. He was fine. It was okay because he wasn't the focus. It was all about Elisa anyway. And then every other character was very, very secondary, tertiary. And again, we did actually get some interesting characters. We did dive a little bit into their background, but I never felt like they were fully fleshed out because they were so far out of the spotlight because we were so focused on Elisa. And so when, for example, we dived into their background, it was always in relation to like somebody telling that story to Elisa, not so that we understand the character better, but because like it was needed to like push the plot forward, or so that she could understand the character, so that like she could make the correct choice for that character, if that makes sense. So it was like anytime we got background, it was only just because Elisa needed that information. Now, it still was really interesting, and I did like a lot of those characters. I just don't feel like they were fully fleshed out. And in this case, I did think it was okay because, again, the focus was so heavily on Elisa that it kind of made sense that we weren't going to be going super in depth into any of these other characters. But one thing I did think that was really interesting is watching relationships change. So, this is obviously relationships between Elisa and everybody else, but I thought it was really cool because there were ups and downs. There were like it felt more like the ebb and flow of a real relationship without being super dramatic all the time, right? Because that does occasionally happen where you get these books that are everything in the relationships are super dramatic. And it wasn't this. There were things that had real consequences, but it wasn't over dramatized. And I just really, really appreciated that. I mean, like Elisa had times where she was hurt by a character, where she even overreacted, I would say, but it didn't feel overly dramatic. And I think that that's a kind of hard line to walk. But I did really appreciate it. So next up, let's talk about the plot. So obviously I can't talk too much about the overarching plot because spoilers, and I'm trying to avoid them. But I will say that there is an overarching plot. I thought it was very interesting. I really liked watching it unfold. The biggest compliment I can give is that I never guessed any of the twists or turns or where we were headed, partially because I was so invested in just reading this book that I never paused to actually speculate about it. So I do think that that is an excellent thing. Like that's definitely a mark of an excellent book, or at least one that I'm enjoying quite a bit. I will say that the first book is actually very self-contained. If you were to read it as a standalone, there are definitely like loose threads at the end of the first book, but it feels very satisfying at the end. Unfortunately, book 2 is not like that. It isn't even a book that could honestly stand on its own. It doesn't have, like, it has two different kind of plots that are going on. One is a romantic subplot, and the other is like this other thing that's going, I can't even tell you what the other plot is. But that other plot, while I could definitely understand why we needed to have that plot, it felt thin. And the romantic subplot kind of felt thin too. And so I didn't really think that it kind of, it's fine as part of the series. Take it out of the series though, and it just collapses. It is just not as strong on the plot. Let's see. One thing that I did also really appreciate is that obviously there's this whole thing that Elisa is going to perform this act of service. We don't know when. She doesn't know when. She's just going to be drawn to some kind of act, and it'll be this service thing that she's supposed to do. And it was really interesting to kind of guess, well, is she going to perform this act of service in these books? And if so, what is it going to be? Like, at what point will it be like, yes, you did it? If she even does it. And I thought that that was interesting as well, because there really weren't any hints as to what it might even be, which makes sense. Once you read the book, that makes sense. But I thought that that was a really fun thing to kind of do. And then lastly, let's talk about the pacing. So for the most part, this trilogy is medium, fast kind of pace. This second book, The Crown of Embers, was not, it felt slow. It wasn't really slow, but it did feel slow, partially because there was a lot happening, but all of the, like, even though there was a lot of action, it didn't do much to drive the plot forward. And that was partially because the plot was kind of thin. And so, like, even though things were happening, it just didn't feel like it meant anything. Now, I will say that I still gave The Crown of Embers 4.25 stars. It's not a bad book. It's just not quite as good as the others. And this was part of it, was that the plot was just not quite strong enough. But yeah, overall, it was a medium, fast kind of pace. But that is it, you guys. So overall, I ended up giving this series 4.5 stars. Girl of Fire and Thorns was a solid 5-star book. The Crown of Embers was 4.25 stars. And The Bitter Kingdom was 4.5 stars. I really loved this trilogy. There is a 4th book that just came out last year that I'm really interested in getting and reading and seeing how that ends up. And I just really loved it. I'm so happy that I reread this series because I really enjoyed my time with it. But that is all I have. You guys, leave me a comment down below if you read this, whether recently or back in the day. Obviously, my conclusion is that yes, this series held up. Let me know if you liked it. Did you not like it? Let me know all the things. But that is all I have. So if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. And until next time, have happy reading, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.